Susan as part of this discussion, and her talk is entitled simply Combination Product, a Risk-Based Approach. Susan, the floors are yours. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Ali. And can you confirm, are you seeing my slide right now? Just
we can indeed, yes.
Okay, great.
We do see your slide. Please go ahead.
I will walk you forward. Okay. So similar disclaimers to Khadija. The views and opinions that are expressed in these slides are those of me, the individual presenter. They're not attributed to any organization with which I have been affiliated. And I will move forward. So we think about combination products. This is kind of basic given the last couple of days of our conference, and I'm sure the experience of all the people that are in the audience, but they bring together life sciences, pharmaceutical sciences, and engineering and technology. In Europe, when we think about life sciences, biologics and drugs, typically they pull them together and refer to them as medicinal products. So sometimes when I'm presenting, I will just share that I use the term medicinal product to make it simple. But that said, many medicinal products depend on medical devices for their administration, and increasingly medical devices contain medicinal substances to support their action. That's the whole reason why we have forums like this. With combination products, we are pulling these different constituent parts together. And ultimately, it's all about benefiting our patients. And there's a whole range of medical fields from vascular care all the way through regenerative medicine that benefit from it. And ultimately, it's the patients that are at the forefront of everything that we do. There is recognition globally across jurisdictions around the world that the higher technical complexity of bringing the different constituent parts together into one product requires strengthening the authorization and certification requirements, and that has been the focus of many regulations around the world. And that regulatory landscape just seems to keep getting more complex. There's regulations for combination products that are currently enforced in the United States and Europe and South Korea and Malaysia, Japan, Canada, Switzerland, and even January, China announced updates to their combination product expectations. And some countries like Australia and Saudi Arabia have draft guidances out relative to how they're managing it. And it just seems to be a constantly evolving area. But the foundation, regardless of jurisdiction, and regardless of whether they even have specific regulations on combination products, is that they are establishing regulatory frameworks to drive successful practices and control strategies to ensure public health. It's all about the safety, efficacy, and usability of these products so that those who are using the products for their intended therapeutic needs and in their intended use environments are able to use these products without any serious injuries or harms and achieving the intended outcomes. So let's focus in on safety, efficacy, and usability. And first, I'll look at safety. So safety in ISO 14971 is defined as freedom from unacceptable risk. So when we think about that and we go, wow, freedom from unacceptable risk, it's translated as safety, efficacy, and usability throughout the entire product life cycle. Not just research through late development, but through its life cycle in the marketplace. And as we are developing these products, part of our job is to weigh the benefits versus the risks to ensure that the benefits outweigh the risks for putting this product on the market. Risk is defined as the combination of the probability of the occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. And that definition is consistent both in ISO 14971 and in the Drug Quality Risk Management document ICH-Q9. So what is harm? Harm is defined as injury or damage to the health of people or damage to property or the environment. And if you, and that's the way it's defined under ISO 14971. And a side note, which is an important side note, is that when we talk about injury, It also includes physical or mental injury, but it also can be interpreted to include non-availability. So if you think about sourcing issues, where maybe there's a supply shortage, that could also lead to injury or damage to the health of people. So that is in scope. And interestingly, if you read the definition of harm under ICHQ 9, it says damage to health, including the damage that can occur from loss of product quality or availability. So really the definitions for harm are lined up very well between ISO 14971 and ICHQ 9. So now if we look at it, and I have a picture here of a person's poor foot that has been bitten by a shark. The context for this is I live in Florida and people talk about shark attacks all the time. Okay, not all the time, but it's something to pay attention to. So when we think about harm and we think about what leads to harm, we think about hazards that could lead to harm and then those hazards becoming hazardous situations. So I'm just clarifying this to make sure that we all have the same context as we move forward in the discussion. So a hazard is a potential threat or risk. So I like to keep my shark analogy going and say, I've got some sharks that are swimming in the water and, you know, by them in and of themselves, they're a hazard. They only become a hazardous situation though, when people or property or environment get exposed to one or more of those hazards. So if I go out swimming and I get surrounded by sharks, that would most certainly be a hazardous situation. Now you could translate that to specific device considerations like energy and cybersecurity, right? There are different hazards and hazardous situations that we take into account when we're developing our products, but this is just a very simplistic way of you to be able to think about hazards and hazardous situations promoting themselves to harms. So with the definition of safety as being freedom from unacceptable risk, and risk being defined in terms of the resulting harm that could come out of it, we think about risk management as a framework. It's the identification and control of the critical requirements that are essential to the safe and effective functioning and use of a medical product. When we think about risk management for devices, for drugs, and for combination products as a whole, the evaluation of the risks should be based on scientific knowledge, and ultimately they need to link to preventing harm, right? We want to protect the patients that are using our product, protect the users that are using our products. And the controls that you put in place are commensurate with the level of risk. If you read through the preamble to 21 CFR 820 for quality system requirements for medical devices, and if you read through management responsibility expectations under ISO 1345, and you read through ICHQ 9, they all talk about controls being commensurate with the level of risk. So when we start applying risk management and we think about a risk-based approach, what we are doing is we are ensuring that that combination product as a whole, as a system, is safe and effective and usable for its intended use, and you're developing and embedding that capability by design through the entire product life cycle. Upstream, during design and development, the risk management that we do basically includes the systematic application of procedures and practices that allow us to assess product and process design during development so that we're proactively eliminating and controlling hazards and risks before a product is ever made commercially and available in the marketplace. During our post-market phase, we're looking at surveillance and monitoring of our manufacturing environment for non-conformances and deviations. We're monitoring the safety of the medicinal product and the medical device or the combination product as a whole after it's been released to the market. And as Khadija Bano mentioned in her previous talk, where she was mentioning the need for people in pharmacovigilance to work so carefully with people in the complaints group, You need to have the whole organization working together as one. And you're doing post-market safety reporting to health authorities so that they can stay abreast of what issues you may be encountering, and ensuring that as an organization, you're putting the appropriate control strategies in place. And the little gold link that I have here between design and development and post-market surveillance and safety reporting shows that there needs to be a very tight linkage between the two every step of the way. And we'll talk about that more through my talk. Each step of the way, when you're doing your thinking, you need to be thinking about each constituent part and the combination product as a whole. I sometimes feel like a broken record, but everything that you do when it comes to combination products is about the constituent parts and their joint use, their interactions. And you always need to be thinking in terms of, what do I need to do for each constituent part? What do I need to do relative to their combined use? Now, risk management has been looked at through different lenses. For medical devices, ISO 14971 2019 is considered the current state of the art with respect to your device constituent part. And interestingly, I will share with you ICHQ9 quality risk management, which is the approach typically used for drug quality risk management. Regardless of whether I'm dealing with a medical device or dealing with a drug, the humor in all of this is that the steps that I take are pretty much the same for both. My understanding is the only difference between these images is because of copyright issues, that ICHQ9 doesn't want to look exactly the same as ISO 14971 and vice versa for copyright reasons. But the content and the expectations between the two is pretty consistent. For risk management, you've got to identify, evaluate, analyze, and assess, mitigate potential product issues as you identify them. And you need to do that, put appropriate control strategies in place, do your benefit risk assessments, and then ultimately your surveillance and reporting post-market. This applies whether I'm dealing with medical devices, drugs, or combination products. There is a chapter that I wrote in a book a couple of years ago that talks about this in more detail. Obviously, in the time that I have allotted during this conference, I can't go into heavy detail, but I'm going to do the best I can to make sure that the important points are brought across. So we've got this foundation to combination product risk management is I need to do the risk management activities relative to my device constituent part. I need to do the risk management activities associated with my drug constituent part. When it comes to combination products, Amy issued an excellent technical report last year called Amy TIR 105, and it is about combination product risk management. And the whole premise of it, I told you I'm a broken record, is that you have to ensure each constituent part and the combination product system as a whole is safe, effective, and usable for the medical product's intended use by its intended users in the intended use environment. And you can see from the little diagram in the middle there, a heavy focus of what you're doing when you talk about combination products risk management is looking for the interactions. You know, if I've got, and the claims being made associated with a product, you need to make sure that you've got the appropriate control strategies and risk mitigations such that those interactions that for the joint use of those constituent parts are not going to result in harm or, you know, serious injury, adverse events to the people that are using those products in their intended use environments to achieve their intended impact. So now let's take a step back and we're going to focus on, well, what does this risk management and joint risk management look like when we focus on the design and development stage of combination product development? We know that for drugs, we apply methodology to drive development of the drug called quality by design, which is defined under ICHQ 8R2. And quality risk management for drugs is defined under ICHQ 9. For medical devices, we apply design controls under 21 CFR 82030. It's also reflected under ISO 13485, Section 7. And risk management, ISO 14971, and I mentioned that the current state of the art is the 2019 version of that, although that is not yet a harmonized, aligned upon version in Europe. That is still considered to be state of the art by notified bodies. So let's take a look at quality by design first. So the whole point of quality by design is to ensure that you're driving deep understanding of your product and your process. You want to ensure that the medicinal product that you are using is going to be safe and effective for its intended use. And you want to develop specifications and control strategies that are clinically relevant. So when it comes to our drug constituent part, we use quality by design and ICHQ9, which I'll talk about in a moment, to define what are the critical quality attributes or performance attributes of the drug? What are the critical material attributes? And what are the critical process parameters? So when we do QBD, it always starts out with, what are the user needs for this product? What are the intended uses? What's the intended use environment for that product? And then you obviously want to look at what are the therapeutic effects that you intend. And based on that therapeutic effect, what are the things that you have to pay attention to? And in the drug world, those CQAs are pretty prescriptively defined. You're expected to define things like purity and stability and content uniformity, your biocompatibility and toxicities, and ultimately pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics of the drug. During development and applying ICHQ9 and even ICHQ8R2, in parallel with your QBD activities, you're running your clinical phases. And those clinical phases are also part of your risk management because they are focused on building that deep product and process knowledge and understanding and preventing harms from occurring as you move this product forward. So in the preclinical phase, you're focused on understanding the drug PK and the drug pharmacodynamics. As you move progressively through different clinical phases with increasing numbers of patient populations or subjects, you are focused on understanding whether drug interactions with the human body using dose ranging studies, then looking at efficacy and side effects of the drug at therapeutic dosing levels, and ultimately in your phase 3 clinical trials, you're actually doing drug testing on the target population to evaluate its efficacy and any adverse reactions that might occur. The safety considerations to minimize medication errors is a guidance that the FDA through CDER, DMEPA has issued. The Division for Medication Error Prevention is that particular branch of CDER has issued this document April of 2016. And you apply this, it's basically human factors for the drug constituent part of your combination product. Now, in the design and development phase for our medical device, similar to the approach that you're taking with drug development, you're applying design controls. And here our focus is on deep product and process understanding associated with the device constituent part. You're ensuring that your medical device is safe, effective for its intended use, and usable for its intended use. And again, that you've got clinically relevant specifications and control strategies. So hopefully it's very clear to you the parallel between device design controls and ICHQ8R2 quality by design. So during the design control process, you're applying iterative design and development, right? You start out with planning, where you've got to very clearly prospectively call out what is it you plan to do to develop this product, so that you can proactively ensure that you're considering the user needs, its intended uses, the intended use environment, the intended regulatory construct, different interfaces between people within the organization that you need to work with. So the design and development plan is a very holistic project planning tool that whenever I talk about QBD and I talk about design controls, It's really project management best practices that have been put into regulation. And the distinct difference between design controls, before I go on, and quality by design is that design controls is a mandate, whereas quality by design is considered best practice. But they really are very much parallel activities. So under the device design controls, I do my design and development planning, which, similar to QBD, starts out with clearly understanding what are my user needs and intended uses with respect to my device constituent part. What is the intended use environment? Am I planning to use this at home, or am I planning to use this in a hospital setting, or maybe it's intended to be used on a playground, just making up different situations. And then a very clear aspect of design controls is functionality of the device constituent part. And this functionality could be the basic functions of how that device operates, but it can also be tied to critical use tasks. So in the device world, we usually conduct what we call a user failure modes effects analysis, or UFMEA. In the drug world, we often refer to that as a user requirements risk assessment, URRA, but they're very much similar documents to one another. But they tie to my human factors and usability engineering, which, as I translate my user needs into technical design requirements, I have to be assessing these critical use tasks associated with using that user interface. And as I am designing those, I am translating those requirements into design input requirements, or technical design requirements. I go through my iterative design build test cycle. And through that design test cycle, anytime I am freezing a design requirement, or freezing what I call my design input, I am now entering into design change control. Design change control really spans almost the full life cycle of my product development for my medical device. Because even if I have frozen a user need, that is something that I have to then manage with respect to changes. Because if I change my user needs, or my intended uses, or my intended use environment, that could change some of my technical design requirements. So I put it under design change control through that life cycle to make sure I'm always going back to reassess, are there any impacts on my technical design requirements based on the beginnings of where it all starts, which is user needs, intended uses, and intended use environment. So I walk through my iterative design test build test cycle, taking into account my critical use tasks, my change control, and where I freeze design outputs, I may also start some of my design transfer activities, which are the activities that I'm going to use to start commercialization of a product. But my design transfer activities really can't start effectively until I've frozen my design outputs, which are the outcomes of my entire design and development process. I verify that the outputs that I have delivered actually match the technical design requirements that I have defined. So for example, if I have designed a medical device such that I have defined its clinically relevant specifications, when I'm looking at my design outputs, I have to prove that what I created is exactly what I defined when I specified it. That is design verification. Once I've completed design verification, and some companies at risk will start design validation activities in parallel to design verification, but ultimately you can't complete design validation until you know that your verification has been successfully completed. My design validation is proving that my product is actually meeting the user needs that I originally started with. So this is a very important step. Human factors is an element of design validation. It is not all of design validation. And I clarify that because over and over again, when I speak to people across the industry, this is something where people in the device world really understand this. In the farm world, there seems to be some confusion where people think that when I do a summative human factor study, I've done all of my design validation, but consider that that's not necessarily one and the same. We may talk about that more when we do the Q&A if I can't, don't have time to go through it now, but let me keep moving forward. Now, when we talk about risk management using ISO 14971, 2019, where I'm working through those stages of identifying risks, analyzing and assessing those risks, putting in place mitigation and control strategies, doing benefit risk assessments, and ultimately post-market where I do risk review, that process end to end feeds into my user needs and it feeds into my design input expectations. And specifically, let's focus in on those critical use tasks. So I've mentioned human factors, but I'll drill in a little bit further because this is a really critical aspect. And as I mentioned, under drug quality by design, the FDA has defined guidance called safety considerations to minimize medication errors or for medication error reduction. Under the device world, we talk to that as human factors or usability engineering. So it all starts out with understanding what are the intended uses of the product. And that could be the intended therapeutic effect, the intended functionality of the medical device. In our combination product space, typically we think about it as what is the intended therapeutic effect or functionality of the combination product. Critical, absolutely critical, no pun intended calling it a critical use task. This is tied to who's using the product. Who are those intended users? What is their experience, their level of education, their training, their age, their cognitive abilities, their physical dexterity capabilities? Those are all things that you need to take into account when you're thinking of intended users and uses. Yesterday during one of the Q&As, somebody mentioned, gee, do I need to fold in naive users or should they be experienced users? Whoever the intended users are for your product, you should be folding those into your use cases for your human factors assessment. And then you have to take into consideration your use environment. This has been a really big deal during COVID, where there may have been a lot of different medical regimens that people would go into their healthcare practitioner's office to get their treatment. And because of COVID, people were staying at home. And all of a sudden, there were medical treatments that people used to get in that medical care practitioner facility or hospital that all of a sudden they're trying to apply them in a home use environment. So that use environment makes a difference because then it ties back to who's the person who's administering whatever the medication is and what's their level of training and experience and dexterity and cognitive ability. So you can see how the use environment really interplays with the intended users and intended uses. Is the product intended for acute care versus non-acute care? What's the dose regimen? How frequently do they take it? Are they taking it once a month, once a year, once every 6 months? The dose regimen matters both in terms of, gee, do I remember to use it or how to use it, but also, what are the storage conditions and how intuitive is the product to use? So that brings us to the user interface. And everything that we're doing when it comes to our combination product and our medical device, and even for our drug, when we consider those user interfaces for the safety considerations to reduce medication errors, it's all about what is it that whoever the user is in their use environment, what are they interfacing with? So for the medical device, it could be the form, fit, and function of that device, right? What's the intended dose volume that you're trying to deliver, the dose accuracy, the flow rate, reliability considerations for that device. If I have an acute care drug like epinephrine, the dose accuracy and the reliability of that product is absolutely essential. It's a life-saving emergency use application. Versus maybe I'm using that product for a non-acute care application, like I have wrinkles on my forehead, I need to go in for my aesthetic dose of now I forget what it's called, that just shows my age, but my anti-wrinkle treatment I would argue that that's non-acute care, although maybe emotionally it's acute care for me, but in the medicinal product space, that would be a non-acute care application, right? What about occlusion detection? Do I have a syringe that I'm using and I have to worry about particulates clogging the nose of the syringe so that patient's never going to receive their dose? So those user interfaces make a difference. Oftentimes in the drug world, we pay a lot of attention to the labeling, and the labeling is, raise your hand if you pay attention to the label and read all the small little print, the four font print that is in the labeling for your product. Not a lot of people pay close attention to it. Therefore, it's kind of obvious that labeling is your last ditch effort for managing risks. Ideally, you are building your risk management into the product by design, but you do have to pay attention to what goes into that labeling, the clarity, the contrast, the size of the labeling. There was a case, I think it was heparin, where there were issues during surgeries because the label was navy blue and the print that was applied to that label was dark black, and the font size of the print was like a 6 font pitch. So you can imagine it's like the worst case in terms of contrast. People that are trying to use that product can't even read what the label says. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to all those considerations that are going to make the label easy and user-friendly. And finally, your secondary packaging, your blister sealing, your cartons. You want to make sure that you've got appropriate tamper evidence, protection, and things that are going to keep that product safe in the marketplace. And we can talk more about even the language here. I'm not going to dwell on that, but maybe as we get to our panel discussion, we can talk a little bit more about the language differentiation between what I'm calling secondary packaging and what a drug person might call secondary packaging. So that said, if we look at our QBD and we look at design controls, what we're doing is we're taking the outputs of my quality by design, right? So I've defined what is critical for my drug, my critical quality attributes, my critical material attributes, my critical process parameters, my safety considerations to minimize medication errors for my drug. All of those serve as design inputs into the medical device that I am developing. Even if I have a medical device primary mode of action that I'm selecting a drug for, my goal with that device is to make sure I'm not doing something that is going to change the characteristics of the drug. So I'm going to treat my drug as a design input into my medical device development. Even my risk management, which has been used to help me identify some of the critical controls for my drug, my materials, my process parameters for the drug, serve as part of the inputs into my device development. And ultimately, I apply my combined use risk management under AMI TIR 105 to develop my combination product. So I'm asking some key questions here. Are there any new hazards, remember potential sources of harm, that could arise from the combined use of the constituent parts of my combination product? Are there any new hazardous situations that could arise from combined use of the constituent parts of my combination product? And what about increased or changed severity of harm that could arise from combined use of the constituent parts? So I like to illustrate it with this really simple example. So let's say I have a drug ointment. It's a topical ointment with drug ABC in it. And maybe by itself, the CQAs and CMAs and CPPs of this drug have been defined. And the benefits of this drug outweigh the risks. But when I do look at this drug, it has some residual risks associated with skin irritation risk if the drug substance alone is applied to the skin. Now, I could also have my medical device constituent part, which maybe in this case, it's a transdermal patch, and that patch has adhesive on it. and maybe there's risk of skin irritation due to the adhesive or due to the materials of construction of the patch interacting with somebody's skin. Okay, well, so in and of themselves, those are things that I would work to minimize those risks. I would try to mitigate them. But now I come up with a combination product, which is my transdermal drug delivery patch, where I've now impregnated the patch with my ointment so that I can deliver the ointment over time to the patient. Now I have a combined use risk. Is there an interaction of the drug with the adhesive or the drug with the materials of construction with the patch, such that now my combined use risk leads me to have maybe increased severity of the skin irritation on the patient, as illustrated in my diagram on the right. So every step of the way, I'm doing my drug risk management on, applying ICH-Q9 and QBD to my drug, applying design controls to development of my device, applying ISO 14971 to my device, my drug, and its CQAs, CMAs, and CPPs are design inputs into my device development. And for my combined use, I look at the interaction effects, and that is Amy TIR 105. This is as simple as I could possibly make it. I'm hoping it's really crisp and clear now. As we look at those combined use risks, the FDA issued ICH-Q12, which is post-market considerations. And if you look at, there is a draft guidance that was issued on implementation of ICH-Q12, and there's a wonderful decision tree in that draft guidance. I've added a question to it, which I'm going to mention in a moment, but those questions that are called out in that decision tree really are good when you're thinking about what are the combined use risks, or when you think about what are the essential performance requirements associated with the device constituent for my combination product. So those requirements tend to be, are there usability or critical tasks that are being accomplished, and are they accomplished without injury or issue, so that I am taking into account the safety considerations to minimize medication errors. Does my combination product have the ability to deliver the labeled dose? Is there any impact of the medical device on the drug critical quality attributes? Is there, now this is the one that is not listed under ICH-Q12's draft guidance for the implementation guide, but I'm going to tell you why it's important. Is there any impact of the drug on the device functionality? So this one is now looking, my drug is still a design input into my device, but I really have to pay attention to this. So consider this possibility. I have a drug that has excipients, and maybe I'm using that drug on an implantable pump. One consideration might be that the excipients from my drug formulation interact with the tubing of my pump mechanism, and the tubing then releases oxidants that cause my pump to fail. Maybe it causes it to rust, and so that it seizes up and the motor no longer functions. That leads to lack of medication, right? Which is a source of harm. Therefore, in that case, I'm looking at an impact of the drug on the medical device functionality. Another example of that could be, maybe I've increased the concentration of the drug in the formulation, or maybe I've changed the particle size of the drug in the formulation. And with that increased drug particle size, I have to wonder whether that drug is now going to cause occlusion issues in the needle of the device. So maybe I have to shake my syringe, my pre-filled syringe, before I'm applying it. But are the particles going to now get stuck in the nozzle of my needle? In which case, again, my device is going to malfunction and I cannot deliver the drug dose to the patient. So the impact of the drug on the device functionality is just as critical as the impact of the device on the drug functionality. So that's my one bullet that I would like to update ICHQ 12 with. Anyways, and then is the characteristic itself, whether it's the device or the drug, essential to the safe use of that combination product based on risk management? So you could use those questions as your guide to create essential performance requirements or identify essential performance requirements that you need to manage through your risk management verification and validation of your combination product. So now let's take a step back and look more now at what we're doing for our combination product risk management. So applying ISO 14971 2019, ICHQ9 and AMI-TIR 105 to each of the constituent parts in the combination product as a whole, the first step that I have to apply in my combination product risk management is to mine my risk data. And that means looking at both a reactive and a proactive data feedback loop. I'm continually assessing post-market data. So Khadijah mentioned during her talk the post-market surveillance and reporting and the criticality of assessing the post-market data that comes in to inform what you're doing to manage risks for your product. You've got to continually assess that data to update your earlier risk management assumptions so that you are maintaining living risk files. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And you want to use that data from post-market data to inform your new products that are in development. And that's how you're turning that reactive data into proactive data. So let's look at some of that post-market data. You could be looking at non-conformances, at deviations, and even corrective and preventive actions. Your corrective and preventive actions is one of the called out provisions under 21 CFR Part 4. So when you realize that it's a called out provision, what you start to realize, it's tied hook, line, and sinker to risk management. So it's part of the risk-based approach that the FDA has called out when they put Part 4 in place. So I've got to go through my very methodical application of CAPA, of problem identification to risk assessment, root cause investigation, and then planning for real root cause fixes, verifying and validating those root cause fixes before I actually implement them, and then ultimately implementing them and verifying that they are effective. That is the very methodical approach you're expected to take under 820-100 for CAPA. And like I said, it's part of the risk-based approach. Another source of your post-market data, it can also be partly pre-market for your risk analysis, is looking at what is happening in the marketplace in terms of voice of customer. You could do market research. You could look at literature reviews or social media or even databases and newspapers, competitive intelligence. Your post-market complaint data and adverse event reporting, product returns is another source of post-market data that is part of your feedback loop to inform your risk management. Your patient experience maps, or looking at customer immersions where you go sit with maybe a hospital setting, understand who are all of the customers in your customer ecosystem for your product. That can include your patients, your healthcare providers, your caregivers, your pharmacists, your hospitals, your medical practices, and even your distribution supply chain and hospitals. The entire ecosystem, you can immerse yourself to understand what are their needs. And those all turn into inputs and things that you can translate into your risk management plan. So I've talked about CAPA, I've talked about your customer interfacing sources of feedback, but there's other sources of feedback, right? We talked about my human factors considerations, what are my intended users, my intended user needs, and intended user interfaces. I can look at my guidance. So the regulators around the world issue guidance, and the FDA has been really good about this, where they issue these guidance documents, and the guidance documents that they issued, they're not doing it for their health, okay? These are current state-of-the-art thinking based on the experience the FDA has gained from other issues that products may have had in the marketplace. And the FDA says, you know what, we don't want this to happen again. So we're going to try to issue guidance so the industry can learn from our lessons learned and apply it to your products that you got in development. So those guidance are something very important to pay attention to. Your clinical trials that you have pre-market are a source of information for your risk management. And there's also post-market clinical trial activity that may be happening. And you can use that information to inform your risk assessment. You can look at predicate devices or similar products that may exist in the marketplace to inform your risk assessments. You can use audits as a source of data. Those could be internal audits, supplier audits, health authority audits, or even your management reviews as sources of input relative to your risk management. And ultimately, those basic risk management tools, doing harm hazard assessments, your preliminary hazard analysis, using your user design process FMEAs or user requirements risk assessments, FMECA, failure modes, effects, and criticality analysis for your drug constituent parts, fault tree analyses. You can see there's a whole plethora of different risk tools that are available to you. Have them in your back pocket so that you're applying the appropriate risk tool based on what you need. If you look at ISO 14971, it actually does not mandate that you use any one particular type of risk tool. It even allows for qualitative risk assessments. But the key is you want to make sure that you're using the appropriate risk tool based on the product that you are developing. So you've got all these different sources of risk data that you can draw and mine your risk assessment information from. And then from that risk assessment, you then start building your risk mitigation strategies and controls. And you have to do your benefit risk analysis. And by law, under the EU MDR, the expectation is you have to drive your risks down to a bare minimum. And then you have to assess your benefit risk analysis. And you want to make sure that any residual risks that may remain are at an absolute minimum and that the benefits outweigh the risks. Ultimately, you are documenting all of this in a risk management file. It is a living document, and that gets housed in your risk management report, which basically houses the history of all the different risk assessments and risk documentation that you have associated with your medical product. Now, when you're getting ready to do your go to market, you have to do your combination product pre-market submission. And again, it's part of the risk-based approach because the FDA and other health authorities are assessing the safety, the effectiveness, and the usability of the constituent parts and the combination product as a whole. So it's about safety, it's about risk management, right? You want to get rid of any unacceptable risks. So that's part of the review process. From there, we move into our post-market activities. And remember, there's a really strong linkage. That's why I've got my gold link between the risk management activities I've done in development to my post-market. So let's look at post-market. So we've got our surveillance and monitoring as evidenced by my little monitoring camera. And so during my post-market phase, I'm using that risk management file that I've created during development, and I am going to use it to inform activities relative to my corrective and preventive actions, my complaints and adverse events and field actions, my post-market surveillance and reporting, which ties to all of those, any non-conformances and deviations, right? The list goes on about sources of information that we just talked about, sources of quality data that inform my risks post-market. Now, the activities that I'm going to take to manage the risks that I learn about post-market are commensurate with the risks that I identify. And the production and post-production activities that I take are going to include design change control, which includes not just my product design, but also process and equipment. Those are all in scope for design change control. My supplier change management is a critical aspect of this, because we've talked about the fact that most combination products, I think Suzette Rowe mentioned it yesterday, most combination products include constituent parts that have, or components or materials that have been purchased. So if your supplier makes a change to that constituent part or component or material, your product could change without you even know it, and that could impact its safety and efficacy and usability. So it is critical that you have appropriate supplier change management built into your post-market activities. And then adapting to post-market information like changes in regulations and standards and literature is also part of your post-market expectations in terms of what you have to monitor and build into your design change control. So, and that one's a very important point because the regulations are evolving rapidly around the world, as I mentioned earlier. So it's a closed loop. So as I identify these product and post-production activities, that then has to inform my risk reviews. So I do an annual product review and maybe even more frequently reviews based on the risks that I'm talking about. And that risk review is then used to update my supporting risk analysis tools that we've talked about, such as my human factors activities, failure modes effects analyses, that whole laundry list of different tools that I said were at your disposal. And you feed that into your risk analysis. Well, okay, so I've now updated my risk analysis based on what I've learned about in the marketplace. So remember, I said that now that can turn into a proactive feedback loop to inform my new products in the market, but it also is an activity to update my risk management file, which is then going to further inform and control and mitigate the product that I have in the market. So hopefully it is driving down the post-market issues that I'm experiencing. So this one slide illustrates the entire closed loop of the risk-based approach for combination product development. So I'm hoping it's helpful. Every step of the way, you are looking at each constituent part and you are looking at the combination product as a whole. So when I am thinking about my design change control, I mentioned just how critical it was. The design includes my product, my process, my equipment, my facilities, my quality test methods and acceptance criteria. It includes my user interface, like my labeling. So all those design inputs and essential performance requirements, every single one of those things that I've listed in that line are defined as design in the device world and in my combination product world. So I can have a lot of sources that could trigger design change. Complaints, adverse events, field of performance, my customer feedback. Remember I said I could survey my customers. Continuous improvement activities, or maybe new users, new intended uses, new use environments. Those are going to trigger change control. They may even trigger the development of a brand new product, right? So you can't just assume that the risks that you've identified all stay the same if I have these different products, these new users and intended uses and use environments. And maybe I've got new markets, or I've got evolving regulatory and technical requirements, or my CAPAs and manufacturing observations that would lead me to make changes. And ultimately, the big one I mentioned is supplier issues or changes, because I think in the combination product world, this is one of the most common. And if you are using a platform device approach for your combination product, this becomes especially important, because under that platform approach, I might be using one type of device that I want to apply to multiple drug constituent parts to deliver them. And my job in risk management is to look at each one of those combination products and look at the unique considerations for each specific use and assess it and control it. So if I'm using my Botox for the wrinkles on my forehead versus I'm using epinephrine for, I'm going into anaphylaxis, obviously, if I'm using the same device for both, my unique considerations for each of those products are going to be dramatically different. So I need to take those into account, and I have to work appropriately with my supplier to address that for that constituent part and the combination product as a whole. So the FDA has issued draft guidance back in 2013. I think industry is kind of praying for updated guidance on post-market modifications. There has been also additional guidance issued for bridging for drug device combination products. And if you look at that document, It's all about what do you have to pay attention to in terms of what's new, unique, and different for your user needs, intended uses, and use environment, and what kind of assessments of essential performance requirements do you need to make as part of the changes. There's draft guidance on human factors for combination products. There's final guidance anticipated within the year. My understanding is it's in final clearance right now. And then there's technical considerations that was issued in 2020 for demonstrating reliability in emergency use injectors. But if you read that document, it applies more than just to emergency use applications. It's about reliability expectations for your combination products. And then your post-market modification final guidance is in development. So as you go forward with your change control, you want to evaluate the impacts for each constituent part and the combination product as a whole. Evaluations of your risk profile, new hazards, new harms, the increased severity of the harms. Look at regulatory submission impacts and other devices, accessories, and interfaces that might be brought into the mix as being impacted. What about your essential performance requirements? And how far back do I have to go in my device design control process based on the change that's being made? My change might require that I have to redo some of my design verification activities. It might require that I'm going back and looking at my design input requirements. It may trigger me to have to go back and redo my entire design control process all the way back to my user needs and intended uses and intended use environment. So you really have to pay attention to every change that you're making and assess how far in the process is it causing you to go back and redo. So with this, I'll conclude. So my combination products risk-based approach really is the root system for the growth of combination products. There's common CGMP elements that have been identified under Part 4. And then there's those elements that are unique for my drug constituent part and my device constituent part. And for my biologics, it's the entire biologic called out provisions. And then there's those things that are unique. So the purchasing controls, clearly that's risk-based. We've talked about it. My CAPA is risk-based. Management controls are communicated to be commensurate with the level of risk associated with the product and the complexity of your organization and the processes for creating that combination product. So lo and behold, it's risk-based. And so I'm going to then take into account my human factors and my safety considerations to reduce medication error and the combined use of these different constituent parts into a combination product. And when I do that successfully, I'm able to enable these medical devices that contain medicinal substances, or I'm able to address these medicinal products that depend on medical devices. It's all about the benefits to the patients. So with that, I thank you and am open to any questions.